I have a question for you, Meg. I have a newspaper clipping from yesterday's Toronto Star. According to this article, there is a phenomenon noticed in some parts of India where some people are killing off their elderly parents. And it's a long article covering half of a page. And some of the details include, for example, that they would poison the moms when the moms reach a certain age, or sometimes above 60. Apparently they do so more with the dads because they feel that the moms are still functional. They might cook or help with the grandkids, or the dads don't seem to be very functional around the house. And it turns out that there are monetary considerations. So where, for example, a pension kicks in, the life of the individual is more likely to be spared. So there are groups who are looking into the rights of the elderly and are looking into this. But I wanted to get your comment on that in the sense that if we take this view of life that people should have the right to choose to die, which is what you're arguing for. You're not arguing for anyone to kill their parents. God forbid that. By taking this view of life that we have control over our own lives, is this departing from the sacred traditions in which we held life to be sacred? It's non-touchable, and now it's all open game, so we take one step and we say, okay, that's fine. Is it possible? I don't want to use a slippery slope argument that says if this happens, the next thing will happen, but we know that people do act on precedents. And here we have a real situation. I mean, you cited the Oregon situation. Here we have a competing or different situation where people are actually doing this. So what's your comment on that?
Well, I think it's something that's deplorable and certainly not something that I would ever support. I'm not seeing a connection between the two, because it's not as though in India they have legalized medical aid in dying. This is something. It's a very different culture, and I don't want to comment too much on that because I think different cultures have their own, beliefs. But it does not seem to me to be remotely connected to legalizing medical aid in dying under very strict circumstances. This sounds like murder to me. And it is totally deplorable. And I don't think, that what I'm saying, I can't say strongly enough that this is about individual choice, and that it would only ever be when somebody has requested it specifically, repeatedly, in their clear mind that they should have that option. And if they haven't asked for it and somebody else takes their life, it is simply murder, and that's what's going on there. But I don't see a connection between the two. There is a really interesting statistic that's come out of some studies there's been a lot of studies, of course, being done on this whole issue of the slippery slope, really. What happens if you open the floodgates. And one of the studies has looked at the incidence of people being assisted to die without consent. And the studies uniformly show that this has been going on all over the world forever, that doctors have, in many cases, been compassionate about someone who is in a coma, in a vegetative state, something like that this has gone on. But one of the interesting things is that when a jurisdiction actually makes it legal, the number of such deaths drops as opposed to rising. So that there is, once it gets out into the public forum, and there are safeguards and procedures that people have to go through, rather than this, in fact, increasing the prevalence of people helping others to die without their consent, it actually reduces that number. And it's happened in virtually every jurisdiction where it has been legalized. So I think this is deplorable, but I don't think it's connected to what I'm talking about. I don't see a causal effect there. Thanks.
Can I follow that up?
Sure.
So I agree with you on that point. And I also agree with you. I cannot myself come up with any great arguments against legalized euthanasia from within a worldview that doesn't itself have some sort of obligation like you would find within a religious tradition. The closest I can get to an argument like that would have to do with either a slippery slope argument, which I don't buy, or the impact on a physician's experience of their vocation as their own orientation towards being a healer begins to move into an orientation towards eliminating suffering in the world by eliminating the sufferer, which becomes something for within the panel of things physicians can do. That can become a very challenging sort of thing. But I want to get you to answer that, but I want to add one other little nuance to it, and that is that we frequently, when we're talking about issues like euthanasia or many other things, focus on the choice of the autonomous individual. The only problem, well, not the only problem, but one problem that I have with that way of framing it is that I'm not an autonomous individual in many ways. I am an individual who is embedded in the lives of other people and whose lives are embedded in my life, and with whom over decades I develop a sense of intertwined life, so that there's very little sense in which there's just my autonomous life and I can make choices about myself when I decide that the suffering is too bad, without significantly impacting another human being. And so I'm getting to my question. I talk a lot. I'm trying to back off on that. My two-part question is this. Number one, what sort of impact does the response of the people who are embedded in your life have on your choice to end your life? And the second part of that has to do with the fact that I'm a pediatric oncologist, because the people that I would participate in are people who would not be making a choice all on their own. And I was out in the hall. The three of us were talking about this kid that I took care of. I've taken care of a lot of children like this, but this is the one we were talking about, who had this thing called angiosarcoma and was in absolutely horrific pain. We had him on the most potent opioid that we could have him on. We had him on multiple other medications. Finally, his mother stopped visiting him because she couldn't stand to listen to him cry. And so he began to telephone her from the intensive care unit because he didn't want to cry alone, and he wanted to cry on the telephone to her. That's where the kid was when they asked me to come. And it turns out that there were only two things that could help his pain. One was to use a quadruple dose of a medicine called Toradol, ketorolac, which is a great medicine. It helped him with his pain. The problem is that if you're on it for more than a few days, your kidneys will fail and you'll die. The other thing that helped him was propofol, which is the medicine that Michael Jackson was on when he died, because it can cause sudden heart failure. And my statement to them was that your primary goal needs to be to help this child with pain. And that's what they did. And so they put him on the high-dose ketorolac. 5 days later, his kidneys began to fail, and he died. Now, I'm not saying, I'm actually throwing that out there for you because I'm not comfortable with a lot of this. But within Christianity, and especially Catholicism, there is a moral principle, the principle of double effect, where you can intend one thing, which is the ending of pain, without intending to kill someone, even if speeding up their death ends up being a consequence of your action to end their pain. I'm more comfortable with that, even from within a Catholic worldview, Christian worldview. That, I think, does have some room. But for that child, what do you think about that kind of embeddedness in choosing for others?
Well, I think it's complicated, and of course you're right, we are all embedded. I mean, for me, if I go back to my mother's situation, I wanted her suffering to end, and I wasn't prepared to go to jail for 14 years to help her, but I certainly did, and in fact, so did everyone in the family. I mean, we were as agonized as she was because we couldn't stand, much like the mother who couldn't stand to be there, we couldn't stand to see her suffering like that. And so we very much wish that she could have her wish. So in that sense, we were all kind of, I do think, and I do know that people who belong to our organization, who come to us asking for, for emotional support primarily when they choose to make the decision, that sometimes there are real problems because their families disagree with this and feel strongly against it. And we always will say to them, you should try to work this out, because it's not. You're not, you're right, they're not acting in a complete vacuum. What they're doing is not, it's not like killing somebody else or anything like that, but it does impact. And I think it does, that you do need to take that into account. But I do think there are a lot, and I've talked to an awful lot of people who've come to me saying, I wish I could, some loved one did die a terrible death, begged me to help them, and I still live in the guilt that I wasn't able to. Or sometimes I get, and yes, I did, and I don't regret it, except that it makes me a bit scared that I might go to jail for 14 years. But that they feel that it is a matter of compassion, and they are working towards helping the other person. I wanted to pick up on your question about the doctors, though, because I think this is very important, and I do believe that it should be a medical professional who offers the assistance, whether it's euthanasia, an injection, or whether it's a prescription. But I certainly do not think that any doctor who is philosophically opposed to aid and dying should be forced to provide it. I mean, I think there are plenty of people in the medical profession who would say, and to come back to the idea of the Hippocratic Oath, I believe that, and you correct me because you are the doctor and I'm not, but I believe the main tenet of that is do no harm, which is very open to interpretation, because I could say you're doing more harm to force that person to keep suffering than you would be to release them. And I think that there's a big difference. It's not that you can only cure; it's do no harm, right? And but I certainly would never suggest that that there be a law passed that all doctors must euthanize patients. I mean, clearly this is a complex ethical issue, and I wouldn't only want to see doctors who believe that they are doing the right thing and that they are fulfilling their duty as doctors to take that on. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, your diet. This is actually, this was part of my journey out, was becoming persuaded of the goodness of God and relinquishing a need to be able to come up with a kind of mental calculus that helped me to connect things and understand how good comes out of every situation, because I can't see it. And so I'm interested from within Islam. Is there any account, is it okay for Ali and Immigrace to suffer in order for me to gain the benefit of rethinking my image of God and becoming more deeply compassionate? So the suffering goes to them and the good accrues to me. And that's a bifurcation of suffering and goodness that makes me uncomfortable. And that's the reason that I said I don't depend on my ability to explain the connections, because I don't see it there. I begin with my experience of the goodness of God and then hope, But I mean, is there anything within Islam that says because you're a creature, it's okay for you to be subjected to suffering for a good over here, even though you're not the beneficiary of it?
What I would say is what I tried to outline in the lecture itself, that some suffering comes about by necessity. It's not that God desires this or deliberately plans that it must be this way. But in the evolution of life, it so happens that some people are healthy, some people are sick. Some people are very healthy and some people are terribly sick. And so that comes out of the necessity of the system. But what I try to say is that out of this necessity, the silver lining in this dark cloud is that some good comes out of it. If I take a simpler example, perhaps a young man that we know so well gets into an accident, the paramedics come to help him. First of all, there are bystanders, everybody's going on, and everybody's feeling the shock of this young man, they pity him. People now get a deeper sense of the worth of life. They didn't realize it before, they took it for granted. Now everybody is really on the up and up with this. People start remembering God. Many ask God to help this young man. The paramedics come, they themselves are affected by this. They go home to tell their families. The families are affected by this story. The young man arrives at the emergency ward, and then there are nurses and there are other people there who are all affected by this. And all of them are being affected in a positive way. They are generating sympathy for this young man. They are developing a deeper appreciation of life and health and the goodness that God has created around us. People are becoming more charitable. And all of this compassion that comes out of this one accident is leading to greater good in the end. And then we start investigating the causes of accidents. If the reason is somebody did not reuse a seatbelt, then we not only enact legislation to prevent further accidents, but we also develop technology. And now I'm learning from my daughter's search for baby car seats that legislation changes. And discoveries about, the car seats that might have been defective and from which babies have been thrown unnecessarily. And now all of this is being revised. New technology is coming into play, and all of this development of new technology requires more science, requires more learning, requires more universities, more students, and so on. So from the bad things that are happening to our good people, a lot of good things are coming out. Not that God deliberately decided to give cancer to this girl or to cause your mom to suffer in this terrible way that you described, and we all are sympathetic to it. But in the end, some good comes out of it.
I'm going to interject for a second here. You've raised an issue that I think maybe we need to start wrapping up this section, but if you could make a few closing statements on this question. We've heard how your worldview influences your understanding of death and suffering and everything. But how does your worldview and your understanding of death influence how you live? So we'll just kind of turn this on its head for a second. So maybe if you could just make a minute or 2 minutes at the most closing statement of how do you live?
Sure.
Out of this perspective that you have, your worldview.
Yes. I spoke about life being a test, and that means for me and for Muslims generally that we watch all of our actions, knowing that whatever we do, big or small, all of this is being tabulated. And on the day of judgment, we will see our whole life played before us. Things that we have done in secret will now be manifest. That which has been hidden will now be shown. And we will have to account for the bad that we have done, and also that we'll be rewarded for the good that we have done. It means that a Muslim cannot walk through life thinking that he or she will get away with injustice, with cheating, lying, stealing, and harming other people. My life is affected by this worldview that I described when it comes to suffering. I feel that without the view that God is in control of all things and that He permits some necessary suffering which He nevertheless redeems and which He rewards in the life hereafter, then life would become very bleak and in fact even meaningless. What would be the purpose of living altogether? And where do we draw the line as to how much suffering is tolerable? If we say that it's fine for a person to take his or her own life under circumstances that the person deems to be the right circumstance, well then on this general premise, then anyone, young or old, can commit suicide, just on the view that the emotional pain that they suffer from, let's say, a broken relationship, or for whatever reason, is much worse than some of the physical pain that we are describing here tonight. And there should be no reason why they should not commit suicide. But my worldview that God is in control of these things and life and death is in the hands of God and should not be meddled with wantonly, it helps to make sense of suffering, such that when suffering occurs, if my mother suffered too, but that yielded or developed in me compassion for my mom, a greater love and appreciation for everything she's done for me over the years. And it made me turn to God to seek a closer relationship with God. So that's bad and terrible. I wish my mom didn't have to suffer. But the worldview that I hold helps me to make sense of all of this, and I hope that God will give her an ample reward that will compensate for all of the suffering that she has had here.
Thank you, Dr. Adling. Dr. Barfield, do you want to talk
Sure.
about how you live?
Well, one of the things I do is pay attention, because I'm no longer running away from pain. And it's allowed me to be present to people who are in the middle of suffering and who are in the middle of dying, and actually learn something from them. But as a Christian, at the heart of my worldview is Jesus, Emmanuel, which is God among us. And the big frame shift that was critical in my own life was to begin to recognize that God is not offering me a set of propositions to help me to account for the things that I'm seeing that are confusing to me. What God is offering is God's self, an actual relationship, that there's no substitute for the person of God. God wants me and wants me to want God in relational terms. And so I've begun thinking very much in terms of relationship, and that helps a great deal. But in light of that frame, where it is not being able to explain why the suffering is happening, but it's actually encountering the living God, and beginning with that point, within that frame, one of the things that I do is to live my life in a deeper sense of gratefulness. And one of the images that I guide my life with as a Christian is a bag. And it's filled up with days. And each morning, I reach in, because I woke up, and I pull out my day. And the weird thing about this day is that I can't put it back in the bag to save it for another day. I can't hand it to someone and say, here, why don't you take this day? I have no choice but to take that thing and spend it. I have to spend it. And so, because of that, and because of one other thing, I don't know how many of those things are in this bag. I want to make sure that when I spend that thing, I'm actually spending it on something that's worth it. Because if I've only got 2 more of those things in my bag, and I take my day and spend it on something stupid, what a waste. And so it's made me very attentive. And every day I approach with deep gratefulness. And even when I'm in the presence of someone who's suffering, I'm there in a different way. I'm there relationally, and I'm there paying attention and ready to walk away, having learned something new.
Thank you, Dr. Barfield. Dr. Westfield, how does your view of your worldview and your understanding of dying affect how you live?
I would say it's not actually that different from what Ray has just expressed, take the God out of it. Because I really do think that it's about, I have enormous faith in the human spirit and in humanity. And I believe that what I want to do is to, as I said earlier, I want to be respectful of my fellow human beings. I want to be compassionate for them. I want to do unto others as I would have them do unto me. And I want to live life to the fullest, because I don't think there's anything out there past there. So I have to make every day count and every day meaningful for me, for my family, for the people I love, and for the people I come in contact with who are dying or suffering and are reaching out, are lonely, are isolated, as so many people who are dying are, because we don't talk about it. People are desperate, they're frightened. And part of what I do is to try to give them reassurance and to try to fight the fight so that they do not have to suffer if they don't want to.
Let's thank our panelists for this part of the program.
This question is directed to Dr. Westley. You said that killing someone to end their life out of compassion, and you made it seem like this is a very compassionate thing to do because they're suffering and it wouldn't be good if they continue to live in suffering. And Dr. Elliott also mentioned this point where he said that the fact that we got this experience of compassion in the first place was because suffering existed. So if suffering did exist and you experienced suffering, this gave you compassion. And now you're deciding to, out of compassion which you received from suffering in the first place, to kill people. So I don't see where this transition, like, you received compassion from suffering, but now you want to end suffering out of compassion. So it's sort of like a circle and I don't know, right?
Okay, I didn't actually say that I received compassion from suffering. That other people, both of them did, but I didn't. I feel like I have compassion without witnessing suffering. I simply have compassion for other human beings. And I don't think of it as killing people. I think these are people who are already dying. They're going to die one way or another. Should we make them suffer for another 6 months or however long? Or if they want, if they feel enough is enough, they have no desire to continue suffering, and they would like to leave earlier, I call that hastening their death as opposed to killing them, because they're already in the process of dying. But to me, there's no conflict there, and I didn't feel that I learned compassion from watching people suffer. Other people did express that view, but I feel like I mean, certainly when I see someone suffering, I feel compassion, but I didn't feel that that was what made me learn to be compassionate.
This is for Dr. Ali, so thank you for your talk. But my question is, I guess as a Muslim, I'm just curious what the Quran says about, like, how do you know that after you die, you'll receive your reward? Is there any sort of assurance? Is there, like, how do you know that your good works or your all your suffering is not just vanity? Like, is there some sort of direction or some sort of marker that God has set up so that we know we're heading in the correct direction?
The answer to that is that the Quran itself says that God does not let the deeds of believers go wasted. And the punishments which are described in the Quran are said to be reserved for the devil and his compatriots, and those who deliberately choose to follow the path of the devil. Maybe in some ways everyone slips and falls, but the Quran assures us through the story of Adam in the Quran that God forgives when we do slip. We believe that we're not born in sin, and that we are only penalized for the sins that we do actually commit. But even so, that God forgives us when we do good deeds. The good deeds themselves cause the sins to be erased from our records. Excuse me. And certainly when we ask God for forgiveness, He is ever willing to forgive us. So with all of these pieces in view, a Muslim should be assured that once one is sincerely trying to serve God and do what is right, though one fails from time to time, one will have salvation in the life hereafter. And I can put it a different way. If not these people who are trying to serve God, then whom?
Thank you.
So we're just going to have a text message question.
Dr. Barfield and Dr. Ali, could you just briefly sum up what the Muslim and Christian perspectives are on euthanasia or assisted suicide?
Sure. So, I mean, there's no, so no. The answer is no. But since I can't give a short answer, let me just add a couple of things to that. And part of the no has to do with a fundamental sense of humility that is associated with being a creature who has an obligation to a creator. And that's why I was saying that I can't think of a non-theist secular argument that's persuasive to me that would rule out euthanasia and making that legal. But for a Christian, it's from within a worldview in which I have an obligation to my Creator, and there's a sense of humility that is the first argument that Christian theology makes against euthanasia. It's much more nuanced than I just said. The second thing, though, is this. There used to be an entire portion of the church that was devoted to something called the ars moriendi, the arts of dying. And the idea, and this is something that's really growing up again in people's minds, but the idea is that as you move towards death and as you find ways to endure, there may be a kind of spiritual work that can be done within the context of that enduring, a kind of character building that can be done within that dying that can't be done within any other context. And that to simply bring your life to an end is to presume that there's no more work like that to be done. But of course, that only makes sense in light of a hope that death is not the end of the story. And so if your worldview is that death is absolutely the end of the story, then incremental moves toward character may not be persuasive in the face of incredible pain.
As for the Islamic tradition, there must have been many people suffering in terrible ways in ancient history. But in the Islamic classical tradition, we don't have examples, we don't have precedents where some active measure was taken to end the lives of people for compassionate reasons. What is noted in the tradition, however, is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that you shouldn't force medicine on your patients. And this has led to the widespread legal ruling among Muslims that if it's a choice of the individual whether he or she wants to take more medication. And the flip side of that is, so in other words, a person may feel that I'm leaving the world and there's no sense of trying to give me more medication, I'll just die and meet my Lord, and I'm fine with this. The flip side of that is that the medical practitioners do not have to continue providing medication to an individual if they do not feel that this will do any good to the person. So there's a certain degree here that there's a certain judgment call that can be made in some situations. And as Meg pointed out, decisions have been made in many societies over time. But now it has become a public discussion, and there's a question of what happens if you then make a legal permission open for people to have euthanasia done. I'd like to also add something to picking up on what Ray said. There is also the understanding in the Islamic tradition that when a person becomes ill, then that person is in a way closer to God, not closer in the sense of closer to the grave, but in fact that the person's du'as or supplications might more readily be answered. And this turns the view around. When Meg speaks of dying with dignity, I understand what she's saying. But in the ideal Islamic context, actually the situation is reversed, where people will come visit the sick person and will ask the sick person to pray for them, thinking that the sick person's prayers might more readily be answered. So it's not all negative, and we can, by thinking of the dignity of the individual, despite all of the suffering, and add to that the idea that serving the dying or sick person is a source of great reward for those performing the service. Well then, Mother Teresa went all the way to Calcutta to do this, to help people who are suffering in many different ways. We may have suffering relatives and we have the opportunity to serve them. We will be getting the kinds of great reward that Mother Teresa was trying to achieve for herself. And we have the opportunity. So things need to be looked at differently. So while Meg speaks of dying with dignity, yes, I understand that. But to me, our thinking needs to turn around so that we do not think that the person loses dignity by being in that situation. Rather, the person is held in a position of honor because his prayers might be accepted more. We get reward for serving that person, and that just changes the situation around. The article I was referring to connects, I believe, with what Meg was saying, because they also show that there are some instances where when the parents feel that they're no longer needed, and they feel that they're a burden on the family, they welcome this. they, in a way, they say, okay, let me die, give me that coconut milk or whatever it is that they're served in large quantities, so that they can just stop being a burden to the family because they feel they're no longer wanted. We have to make the person feel that he or she is precious to us and that we love to have them around, though we feel their pain and we cringe every time they moan with pain, and we would rather this had stopped, but that's not in our hands, and we leave that to the hands of God, thinking that the life, and this is one last thing I think is important, in the Islamic concept, it is understood that life is an amana, or a trust, that we must just simply deliver up to God whenever He calls for it, and it's not our calling. So suicide is impermissible or haram, and by extension, the Muslim jurists say that assisted suicide is of the same vein. Though obviously they're not the same thing, but they fall in the general broader category.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. I think my question will follow up your response there quite well. My name is Matt. I just want to thank you, Dr. Westley, for sharing your story. And I know I can begin to sympathize with you as I watch my uncle die of ALS, which is a progressive neurogenic disease. But as I'm a first-year medical student, and although given some situations, it can be a lot easier to, I guess in all of us to say, yeah, I think it's right to end suffering, but in life, things are never black and white, and I'm going to preface my question just with something that kind of gives another side of it. So, given the scenario where there could be an elderly man or a woman who wants to use euthanasia because he or she feels that they're becoming a burden to their family, their parents, they can feel the suffering around them, although their quality of life might be quite good. Do you think it's fair for a medical professional to make these decisions, the decision if the person meets criteria for euthanasia, and going to a full investigation if there's other motives or how stable this person is and maybe they need psychiatric medication? Just as the issue of abortion is legal, but it's ultimately up to the physician if they will or will not. Every physician has their own limit on that if they do practice abortion. Oh yeah, sorry. So my question is, do you think it's fair for a medical professional to be put in this situation? And I guess it goes out to everybody, especially Dr. Barfield as well, as somebody who deals with that every day.
I would say that I'm a little bit confused by the situation you described. If the person is feeling like a burden but is still in reasonable health, they would not be eligible, and the doctor shouldn't be put in that position, though. It should be established by law that the only circumstances under which this would be legal would be if the person has an incurable or terminal illness. And is suffering, and is mentally competent, and is not being coerced, all of those things. So the situation that would refer back to what you were talking about as well, of the elderly person who's feeling like a burden. I agree, we should be doing everything we can to make them not feel like burdens and to find ways to make their life. I do not think that is not the same as being an intolerable suffering with an incurable illness. That's a very different kettle of fish, and I don't think, and I would not want to see legislation that would come in without safeguards that would prevent that kind of situation arising, because I think for elderly people that can be a very real feeling that they have, that they are a burden, that life isn't as worth living, but I don't think that's a good reason for them to seek euthanasia. I think there's other ways, as you say, there may be psychiatric treatment that can help. There's a variety of other ways that we can deal with that. The only situation in which I think it's acceptable for a doctor to aid a patient to die is if there is no hope of reprieve or recovery. So that answers. Other people may want to jump in on this one.
Well, I think I think you certainly can't, as with abortion, force physicians to do something. I'm regularly put in this position. Just last week I had a mom ask if I would go ahead and help her baby just go on and die. And we had to have a long conversation about why not. Because that possibility and the fact that I refused it put me in a place where there was the potential for a breaking of trust. She didn't want her child to suffer, but this was an infant, and I said, no, I won't do that, but I will do everything I can to help your child not suffer. But I don't think that physicians can afford it. But there are nuanced ways to do it. I think the relationship becomes so complex. I mean, I think this is a deeply complex thing when you begin to talk about the relationship between someone requesting this and a physician struggling with whether or not to help. If I had somebody that I've known for 40 years in my practice, of course I would have had to start practicing at 8. And they tell me, you know, Ray, man, you know, you've been my doctor for all these decades, and I mean, I've got to end it. Well, if I say no, that puts me in a complex situation. So I think it's extremely hard. I also think it's hard to answer a question about whether or not deep existential suffering in the absence of a biologically fatal disease would also constitute a reason for euthanasia. And I think that's a question that needs to be discussed if we have a full conversation about it.
It's Dr. Westley, right? So my question is on your view on euthanasia. So I feel like suicide doesn't affect just the ill person themselves, but their close friends and family as well, because it could hurt them as well. And so my question is, how do you think it's fair for the ill individual to end his or her life when it could affect other people as well? So another way of raising that question is, can it be said to be equivalent to assault, whereas the only difference being emotional pain delivered versus physical pain delivered in an assault?
I think it depends entirely on how it's handled. I mean, there's no one size fits all here. I think that in a lot of situations that I know where people have ended their own lives, that this is at the end of a long discussion with all family members, where the care that is, the passing on of wisdom, of forgiveness, of clearing the air, all of that has happened. In some instances, I know where people choose to end their lives when they're suffering horribly, there's no hope of recovery, and they have practically a party. They have, 10 or 12 people come, they have toasts, they have a drink, they celebrate the fact that this person has had a wonderful life and is finally able to find some relief from their suffering. So I don't, I think ultimately, and this is, I'm not supposed to be brief. I think dignity is a subjective thing. I don't think anyone can tell someone else that their life has dignity, nor do I think any of us can say whether the suffering is intolerable. I think when the suffering is intolerable, I think most people would say, I would rather you were released and relieved of that suffering than I want you to hang around because I still need you to be here and I don't really care if you're hurting a whole lot, but it's not fair for you. I'm sorry, that's a very selfish attitude to me. But I do think it's important on how it's handled. I think that people go out with grace, respect, and compassion for the people they're leaving as well. I'm trying to be short.
Dr. Barfield, you mentioned that our suffering, we don't try to figure it out within a Christian tradition. If so, what was the point of God's suffering in your tradition?
Point of God's suffering? Yeah. Well, so I would clarify that we do try to understand. What I was trying to press on is the idea that an explanation, a set of propositions that tries to create what's called a theodicy, which is how you hold together the idea of a good God in a world filled with suffering. How that can never become an adequate substitute for what God is actually trying to do, which is to deepen our relationship. The suffering of Christ, this is something that, for Christians is what we call a paschal mystery. For me to be able to give an account of the meaning of that suffering would be for meaning to be the blackboard and the dot to be my perspective. Nonetheless, there's a deep sense in which, for Christianity, the experience that Christ had of suffering is something that links him to us in our suffering. It would take a lot longer to be better than that.
Thank you.
Hi, my question goes to Dr. Ali. The ideas of heaven and hell are a fundamental part of religion, and one could even say that they're the end goal of religion. While the idea of heaven and paradise can be reconforting to someone who's dying and who knows that he's suffering, the idea of hell can cause a horrific amount of psychological suffering. What is your opinion on that?
I think for this reason, we should not overuse the imagery of hell and the mention of hell. When the Quran mentions hell, it is mentioning this to scare those who are deliberately turning away from God. You will not find in the Quran that hell is promised for minor sins, for example. On the other hand, you will find that hell is promised for those who deliberately turn away from God, those who deliberately follow the ways of Satan, and so on. It is the Islamic tradition that has steered people into thinking that, man, this little minor sin that I committed, this will land me into hell. That to me is an incorrect way of thinking. Because the Quran, in fact, explicitly says that if you stay away from the major things, then God will forgive you the minor sins. And many traditions reported from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, say that when Muslims stand up for prayer, their sins fall away from them like leaves fall away from trees in autumn. And many in the same vein. So we should not overplay the imagery of hell. Of course, if one has been deliberately pursuing the ways of Satan, then one might feel this angst. But that is something that I cannot control. That's for the individual. However, our hope that we hold out to such individuals is that as long as you have life and breath, if you can ask God to forgive you, then God is ever willing to forgive you. So rather than be afraid of hell, just hope in the mercy of God. And that mercy is available and freely given out.
Thank you.
Hi there. First of all, I want to thank all panelists for their presentations. I want to admit that my presence here, it's not only from an intellectual quest, it's also from a personal quest, as my grandfather just died last week. So I have 3 very short questions for each one of you, because I had a few wonderings. For Dr. Shabir, I understood from your presentation that in a monthly worldview, suffering is necessary and can produce in this possible world created or actual world that we live, can produce moral qualities and character in us. How this understanding can lead to somebody to take the view that, for instance, I can take a gun and just shot people around or something like that and create a great evil, and from that I would hope, well, people can extract from this evil something bad for their, good for their lives, and it will produce something desirable. So how can somebody reach this conclusion, and how can be prevented? For Dr. Westley, I understood from your presentation that moral okay.
You can come down here afterwards and do the other 2 questions.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, as for the question already asked, notice that I didn't say that God deliberately inserted these evils. What I said is that it seems to me that God would have had a conception of a possible world, this one, And then the question was, do I actualize this world in which there is such a mixture of good and evil? And the answer for God must have been, well, yes, by actualizing this world, first of all, there will be a great and abundance of good. There will be a small amount of evil, which I can control and limit, and out of which I can bring some good things. And in the end, the people who suffer this evil, so that this good can come about, will in fact be rewarded for their suffering in the life hereafter. Now, this is very different from the person walking into a movie theater, Batman style, and shooting a whole bunch of people. Because, first of all, this is deliberate enactment and inflicting of evil on people, inflicting of harm. Second, this person inflicting this harm does not have the full control or the wisdom of God to know all of the fallout and all of the effects. First of all, he cannot repair this evil, and he doesn't have any intention to begin with. And even if he did, he probably doesn't have the power to repair all of this evil. And he probably doesn't have the knowledge to know all of the fallout from his actions. So, as human beings living within the worldview of faith, we derive the sense of goodness from God, whom we know to be good. And that sense of goodness guides us to choose things which conscientiously we know to be good, and to stay away from things which we know to be bad. And most people would know that going into a movie theater and shooting people at random is terribly evil. And if some people don't know that, we treat this as an aberration. And if that moral conscience was not enough, added to that, we have the guidance in the form of Scripture, which tells us what's good and what's bad. And so we have a worldview that steers us into what is good. Therefore, there's no way that what I've described should really advocate or lead to someone advocating the hypothetical scenario which you posited. Also for a good discussion.
Hi, Dr. Westley, it's for me. If a person suffering who is, of course, biased by the pain has a right to choose death over life, who defines what kind of suffering allows you to make that choice? You mentioned your mother found in her suffering, her mental pain reflected her physical humiliation and difficulty. So if someone is suffering from depression, and as you mentioned, dignity is subjective, where they feel death is the only option, or would we question their right to die, and should we question their right to die?
It's a very big question, and I think that it's a complicated one to answer, and I don't have a straight answer on that. I think that we get into a very gray area if we start to say that, yes, somebody who is having a psychological or mental health issues and feels they are suffering, they may indeed be suffering intently, but I would be very surprised if there's a doctor who would say that this is incurable and terminal. And as long as there's a possibility that you can cure it, that you can relieve the suffering, and that the person can have a quality of life, then I don't think that we can justify allowing them to have an assisted death.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have tonight. We just wanted to take a few moments to thank our speakers, to thank our moderator, and to thank our volunteers. Without you guys, there's no way we could have pulled this off tonight. So thank you so much.